Welcome to Better Than We Found It, the podcast dedicated to people who have a purpose-driven mission to leave a positive legacy through their leadership. Here, we bring you a diverse range of executive leaders and aspiring future leaders engaging in thoughtful conversation around harnessing sustainability to guide a responsible leadership, creating positive change, and ultimately driving value creation. I'm your host, Josh Huggins, and the founder of GS2 Partnership, a global talent solutions firm focusing on current and future leadership positions within sustainably conscious and positive impact organisations. We are on a critical journey to connect to the people who believe in leaving the world better than we found it.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Better Than We Found It. I'm delighted today to be joined by Ruth Handcock, the CEO of Octopus Money. Ruth, it would be great to have a quick introduction from yourself around your role, your remit, for those who don't know about Octopus, what the group is, and in particular, what Octopus Money does and what it stands for. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to join because I think we have a lot of thoughts in common. So as you said, I'm CEO of Octopus Money. Octopus Money is a business with a mission to give everyone in the UK access to money help from a real person. And I found over the years, working in retail banking, but also running a different Octopus Group company called Octopus Investments, that while people with lots of money find it quite easy to get help, most people in the mass market say they need help when it comes to money, but don't know where to go. So Octopus Money partners with employers to provide every employee in a workplace access to someone who can help them with all of the massive benefits that goes with that, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I've been part of the Octopus Group for 5 years. It's a phenomenal group of companies with a mission to invest in the people and places that we think can change the world. So the way I did that for the last 4 years was running actually the original bit of the group called Octopus Investments. That's an asset manager that invests predominantly retail investors' money into all sorts of sectors to drive UK growth. So that might be venture capital, it might be renewable energy, it might be healthcare, education. And what most people might have heard of Octopus from is our sister company, Octopus Energy, that we started 7 years ago, that obviously has a big passion to deliver net zero. And we're all incredibly proud of the values that Octopus Energy has really exist across the whole group.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for explaining that, and definitely keen to get into the different elements of the group and the roles that you've played there. But perhaps if we could take it all the way back, because I think it's really interesting to understand where people's purpose came from. And I know that happens at different stages of people's journey. But from your perspective, where did your passion for engaging in, I suppose, mission-driven objectives and also organisations that follow that with that greater purpose come from?
Yeah, I think I've always had it. So after university, my first instinct was I want to work in an industry that's going to make people's lives better. And one of my first jobs was as a consultant to organisations in the public sector. So I worked giving out grants to charities across London. I worked on the 2012 Olympic bid, which shows how old I am, and all of the regeneration benefits that would bring to London. And I found that the transformation that you could make to lives and communities from that, I found very inspirational and drove me. What I found much more difficult was working at the pace of the public sector. And so I found over my career, I've kind of oscillated from the private sector, which suits me from a work style. It's much faster to make decisions. And actually, we can talk about this later, but I think an element of profit motive in an organisation can be a really positive thing in terms of making change happen. But I feel inspired by working in places that are going to leave the world in a better place. So I also worked in international development for a while out in West Africa. And again, found even there, I matched spending some of my time working in the government with some of my time helping set up a school, because I kind of need that instant instant impact at the same time as understanding that some societal problems are long-term and relatively intractable. Where I've gravitated towards over all of that is therefore mission-driven private organisations. It's kind of my sweet spot, I think. And I struggle if either of those things aren't true.
Sure. But prior to university, I suppose, and in your childhood, did you? Yeah, was there where did this come from? Do you think were your parents pushing this type of approach to you, or was it something around your friendship group or where you grew up? Tell us a bit more around when.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think everyone's background has a big impact on where they end up. The two things that have probably become more and more important to me from that background is firstly making sure that people have opportunities regardless of the family they're born into. So I had a very happy childhood, but I was my parents got divorced when I was very young. My mum was a single parent, worked very hard, but we definitely didn't have much, and it was very important that everyone worked, everyone contributed. I think the sort of roles I've done in my professional life were roles that I could never have imagined a kid like me from the Midlands going to my local school would ever end up doing. And I think that I've ended up getting lots of opportunities through a combination of luck and hard work. And the luck bit isn't good enough for me. I don't think it's fair that if you're born into a certain life, you have less chance of sort of making the best of yourself and living a fulfilled life than others. So that concept of social mobility has always been very important to me, because I feel like I've been very fortunate to get the opportunities that I have. I think the other thing, I've always had an interest in kind of society and education and the role that then plays in opportunity. So certainly I found when I lived in Sierra Leone, I gravitated towards education being the thing that I could change. And I think it's because, and if I read books, often people talk about they had this one inspiring teacher or this one inspiring person that piqued their interest in something. I don't really remember that from my education at all. It's not that my teachers weren't doing their best, but I never got that spark of inspiration. And I think that's, again, something that can really, really transform lives. So almost the absence of that has driven me to feel like it's particularly important, and like it's one of the things that can allow people to change their own outcomes, take control of their lives, but give them the opportunities to live the life they want to live.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for explaining that and sharing. I think that's a common trait that I do hear with lots of individuals I speak to, that either the absence of something or the reinforcement of it, and of course there's different angles of how that is to be, can inspire them to really focus on this area within their career, which is interesting. I'm keen to dive into the piece around Sierra Leone. So you've done this work in the public sector in the UK. Where did the move to Sierra Leone come from, and tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I'd been working for about 7 or 8 years at this point. So I'd done some public sector consulting, some private sector consulting, and came across an opportunity to join a team of people working in Sierra Leone in sort of one of those completely serendipitous ways of just a friend who happened to work in the civil service, saw a job advert and thought I might be interested. And I went for 4 or 5 job interviews. And I remember vividly going to the last one and thinking, oh goodness, they might offer me this job. and I can't not take it, because one amazing opportunity. So it was a phenomenal charity set up by Tony Blair when he left government. So it was 2010 when I went up. So he'd been out of government for a couple of years. And he'd found in his conversations with African leaders that many of them had great aspirations for their country, but a couple of countries in particular, so Rwanda and Sierra Leone, that were recently post-conflict at that point, didn't have a civil service that was capable of delivering their vision, simply because many people who were educated and middle class had left during the civil wars and decided not to come back or hadn't returned yet. And sort of the whole fabric of government had been on such a war footing that lots of the basic services didn't exist anymore. So this charity, the Africa Governance Initiative, was one of the few that worked to the agenda of the local government. So my job going out there was not to deliver any UK government initiatives, but to work to the initiatives of the Sierra Leonean government. So I worked in the Ministry of Trade because they'd correctly identified that if they were going to get the country back on its feet, they needed to have a thriving private sector, and they needed people who were considering investing in the region to feel like it was a safe investment climate. So I spent my days doing all sorts of things that I'd never done before, thinking about international tax law, thinking about how you create an investor roadshow of the opportunities for investment, actually hosting investors, and every quarter having Tony Blair come out and sit down with the president to say, well, this is how I think you could lead through these periods. So a phenomenal experience. And as you can imagine, not only a very different work experience, but a very different life experience as well. And both of those things actually had different impacts on me. So the work challenges of working in a completely different cultural context, and then the life challenges of living in a place that at the time was the poorest non-conflict nation in the world. So clearly very different from what most of us are used to.
Sure. And had you travelled? Had you travelled that part of the world before?
No, I hadn't. I travelled. I tried travel quite a lot. I love travelling, but never to that part of the world. And not many people have been to that part
No.
of the world because, particularly given the conflict in that region, there's not really an established tourist track. Even when I go back now, finding a hotel or a taxi is quite difficult. That said, it's one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. The beaches in Sierra Leone, one of my favourite fun facts, and again, it will show people's age if they get this, was where the original Bounty advert was filmed. So there was this iconic Bounty advert where someone was laying on a beach under a palm tree, and that's the sort of beaches of Sierra Leone. So it's a beautiful, beautiful place that had a thriving tourist industry in the 70s, but and hopefully one day will again, but not yet.
Sure. And with the Tony Blair input, I suppose a couple of things that come to mind. I suppose the education piece rearing its head again with perhaps what you had seen in your childhood, and then back to a location and I suppose an environment where education probably wasn't at the level that it should have been. It's quite interesting as to where you've got to now. How much FaceTime did you get with Tony Blair? And I assume that would have been part of the discussions of how you would rebuild this this community through education and how tell us a bit about how that played a part.
Yeah, it was. He was incredibly committed and still is. So he would come at least every quarter and spend an awful lot of time with both the team and our counterparts in government to coach as much as anything else. From his experience in politics for so long, coach, convince, share thoughts, share ideas, not dictate, importantly. And again, one of the sort of attachments that Tony had to Sierra Leone was his father was a lecturer at Fora Bay University, which used to be one of the most prestigious universities in West Africa in Freetown in Sierra Leone. His father had taught there in the 70s, so he felt very connected to it. And again, it brings forward that education link, and it was clearly, particularly in the early part of his time in power, one of his key themes. So it was a huge part. I mean, basic services, education and healthcare were the things that we talked about most, is how do you provide basic healthcare to as much of the population as you can, and how do you raise literacy rates? So again, when I was there, Sierra Leone's literacy rates were, sort of terrible on a world ranking. About 50% of adults couldn't read and write, which creates all sorts of societal challenges. So even when things like mobile banking were coming into play, you realise it's one thing paying someone on a mobile phone. It's a different thing if they can't read what they've just been sent.
Sure.
So that trying to reset the country, recreate a set of individuals with basic skills that means they can then build a government, they can build a thriving private sector. You've just got to start at grassroots with, can everyone in the country read and write, and have those basic skills? So it was all linked together, but again, incredibly daunting, because the amount that the government had to spend on basic services was something at the time like £600 per member of the population. I mean, how do you do roads, healthcare, education, anything on £600 per member of your population? So one of those challenges where you're not only trying to do everything, but you're trying to be very focused on what are the basic things that we can do that both relieve some of the stress in the population in the short term, but start to build the country and the government back to strength in the medium term. Not an easy thing to do.
No, and I suppose that's where this investment angle comes in, because how is it an attractive investment if we purely think of it from a return and financial perspective into the country where you have this illiteracy rate, but it's required in order to drive it forward to hopefully improve that and getting that balance right. So I know when we spoke before joining this call, we spoke about the fact that your role involved a lot around the investor work, due diligence, structure, value creation. How did you find the difference between doing those types of deals or business transactions in that environment in comparison to the work that you've done in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, completely different for a couple of reasons. Partly because you're operating in a legal framework that is much less well established. So the risk that investors are taking in a market like that is substantially higher because the legal protections don't exist. So you can underestimate just how important that is when someone's trying to make a business case. So that's completely different. The skills problem is massive. So it was always in the interest of the government of Sierra Leone to attract investors that would create local employment. But you sort of had to acknowledge that that local employment probably wasn't going to be at manager level, because the amount of people who'd got the training to be able to do those jobs was quite poor. So how do you create that balance of creating training programs that again changes that over time while acknowledging that you can't change it overnight? So that was quite a big deal as well. And then I guess thirdly, the cultural context of how things get done. And it was probably, of all the aspects, the most fascinating one to me, which is you can grow up thinking, well, this is how a meeting should be run. This is our concept of nepotism. This is our concept of how a project should run. And you walk into a different cultural context and all of the cultural rules are different. And that doesn't mean they're wrong. It's very tempting to walk into a situation like that and think, oh, how do I make it more like ours? It's not the right answer. How do you actually think of creating success within that cultural framework? Which is very different, and kind of getting used to 6-hour long meetings, which may not have been how I'd run it, but quite important for participation and people getting the chance to speak. And in that cultural context, it was the way of getting buy-in, which you need to get anything done. So it means that now I think when I get chucked into a different situation, you do make yourself take a step back and go, well, how can I get the best out of this situation, rather than how do I take control and run it in the way that I want to run it. So that was definitely one of the things I learned, role modeled by Tony as well, who clearly was doing that his whole political life.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the baptism of fire to take that change, but I'm sure huge learning that you took back and have used with you through your career, which is fantastic to see. So from there, you transitioned pretty significantly into. Was it straight into Bacardi, or was there something in between? But
yeah, I worked for Tony in the UK for a little bit, but then went to Bacardi.
Yeah, so having been in quite an unorthodox environment, I suppose, and then into Bacardi, which on paper seems like a significant shift from what you were doing. What prompted that move, and what were you hoping with that?
It's hard to argue it's not, and it's very much for me. It was a personal career pivot point. So when I came back from Sierra Leone, I was a different person, but I was also convinced, for some of the reasons I touched on at the beginning, that a career in international development was not for me. I always thought if I went back to that region, I'd want to go and run a company and employ local people, and I definitely wouldn't rule that out for the future. But that was where I concluded I would be happiest. The challenge I had from a very personal perspective at that point, though, was that I had quite an eclectic CV already. So I'd been a consultant. I'd actually been an editor in the very first part of my career. I'd worked in international development. Oh, sorry, light's gone off. Having lots of conversations with people at that point about where should I take my career next, I could say to people, oh, you can just kind of give me anything and I'll figure it out. But that's not a particularly good pitch when you're going into a commercial organization. Someone kind of needs to know where to put you.
Yes.
And it's one of the pieces of career advice I often give to people now is at some point in your career, and you don't have to rush to it, but at some point in your career, you need an anchor point. So you can say, if you're going to put me anywhere to start with, put me here, and I will expand out from there. And I really heavily debated at that point in my career whether I should go and do an MBA and use that to create an anchor point, or whether I should go and do a job in a much bigger, much more commercial organization and find an anchor point. And again, kind of serendipitously, I came across a role in Bacardi as a finance manager. And having been a scientist by education and quite numerical in my thinking, I thought that's probably a good fit for me. And so all of my reasons for going there was I need to learn how to anchor in finance, and that will open up a whole next wave of my career and give me lots of opportunities. And it was, again, another bit of career advice that I hear from lots of people is they kind of don't be afraid to step back, to step forward. You know, I went from my job title being COO to my job title being finance manager. And it was one of the best things I've ever done, because if I hadn't done that, many of the things that I did after that wouldn't have happened. But I learned on the job, ended up as an FD running, a £2 billion P&L. So a really interesting job. But as I suspected, while the career learning was phenomenal, the mission of the business wasn't evident enough. It's not a bad business in any way, but the mission wasn't sharp enough for me to think, okay, this is where I want to build the rest of my career.
Yes. But interesting, I suppose, at the time, and thinking of it from a recruitment perspective, of the sort of wild card nature of your CV, I suppose, on the shortlist. I'm sure, if your CV was amongst the 4 or 5 others that were going forward at that point, who were probably finance managers in smaller firms or, from the drinks industry, to then have somebody with quite a broad spectrum, having been at this level, there's probably a big gamble, I suppose, from their side that they took the chance on you, but had the opportunity to then probably see you expand beyond what perhaps some of the others in the shortlist could have done. And I think it's something we talk a lot to our clients about, is considering the transferable skills and not just recruiting for the role you're recruiting for, but where could that take somebody within the organization. So just something I
completely agree. And I don't think I will ever, my CV will never look like a round peg for a round hole. And I sort of made my peace with that quite early, but it means that where I tend to end up is working in organizations where competence and flexibility and resilience is valued above other things, because that's what they've recruited for in the first instance. And I have a real bias towards that. Clearly, you have a bias towards people in your own image. That's one of the real dangers of recruitment as well.
Yes.
But it is a profile that is much harder to recruit for. But it's one that can just go in directions that you perhaps don't expect, or create unexpected pools of value just because someone's able to think a bit more laterally about a problem, that if you're brave enough to do it now and again, I think can create great opportunities both for the individuals and for businesses.
Sure. And I think absolutely, and we'll definitely come on to this, but in this sustainability shifting or focus society, in such a new and evolving space, you aren't recruiting people who are, it's not a well-trodden path, and the roles and organizations and opportunities that are coming are newly created, and people are figuring them out as they go. And I think if you try to recruit in the traditional sense, you will fail. And it's much more around behavioral competence and considering those. So yeah, I've certainly subscribed to that mindset. So you left, so you moved on from Bacardi, and since then, am I right in saying it's been financial services has been the focus of where you've been focusing your time? So tell us about the move from Bacardi, I think through Tandem, and then into Octopus. What was the state of play there?
Yeah, so the theme that probably haven't touched on that became one for me in my 20s, so before I went out to West Africa, was a theme of entrepreneurialism. And I found myself much happier in roles working for entrepreneurs who tend to give you more freedom, tend to value delivery over anything else. And so one of the consultancies I'd worked for in my 20s was exactly that. It was founded by people not much older than me who recruited an incredibly talented set of people and then said, well, off you go, see what you can do.
Yes.
And I really thrived in that environment. So after my Bacardi experience, I knew that I wanted two things. I knew I wanted a mission-driven commercial organization, and I knew I wanted something smaller and more entrepreneurial. And I met a couple of entrepreneurs who wanted to start a bank. And this was in 2013, 14, when the only new bank over the last 100 years, certainly the only banking license over the last 100 years had been Metro.
Yeah.
The whole fintech challenger banking sector didn't exist. So finding people who were like, we're going to start a bank. The Treasury was saying we'd like people to do it. The regulator was saying we'd like people to do it, but no one had actually done it. But it was a bit like that Sierra Leone point where when they offered me the job, I thought, I can't let this go by. Imagine if this incredible bank existed and I wasn't part of it. So I jumped to do that. And it was certainly one of the most intense, but one of the most, the richest career moments I've ever had. So, over the first 2 years, we got the first new retail banking license after Metro. We built a whole team. We built a whole tech stack. We launched a bank. Incredibly intense, difficult thing to do. But I learned no end, not least how a bank works, which I felt like writing our regulatory banking application was like doing a banking MBA in about 6 months. It was absolutely fascinating.
It must be. I mean, as you were saying that and made it sound quite nonchalant, but launching a bank, that's such a big shift for society. And you think back to the traditional banking systems and creating something that's going to rival them in some capacity. That's nobody had that skill set at the time, did they? No,
and that's the fascinating thing is I think even when these entrepreneurs were trying to find someone to join them, they were asking around like, we need someone who's sort of a bit of weird shape because no one's done this. We need someone who's sort of mad enough to think like us and think we can do it. And it was a great time. So I definitely look at some of our peers at that point, the Monzos and Starlings of this world, of various reasons. I think a lot of them executed, particularly their technology, better than we did. But it was quite a collaborative group of people, and we'd sort of sit together and talk about how the regulatory process was going. And our view was this sector will thrive if most of us survive, where the lack of consumer trust, if you get banks blowing up all over the place, is going to really kind of dampen this wave. So it was a really nice time to be part of that sector. And it was a complete roller coaster that got me more deeply into financial services. I'd done a bit of financial services consulting, but it really, a bank is an incredibly complicated business. So getting really deeply into that felt like it gave me all of the tools I needed around risk, regulation, balance sheet, credit that would allow me to then build a career in financial services. But it also taught me, resilience, fundraising, team management, team downsizing, down rounds, all of this kind of founder entrepreneur journey that again sets you up for kind of whatever your career throws at you after that point. So definitely taught me more than probably any other period in my career.
Sure. And then I suppose with that mini MBA, I suppose in entrepreneurial work within, I suppose, sort of financial services and transitioning business models, I suppose Octopus, on paper would seem therefore the place to be because it was one of the brands that's so well known for its entrepreneurial passion, but also to tackle those kind of core social issues. How did the interaction with Octopus come around, and tell me about what the initial mandate was when you first joined.
Yeah, and it was fortunate in many ways that Matt, who was one of the guy Matt Cooper, who was one of the founders of Tandem, was also chair of Octopus. So that was the link for me. But it comes back to, again, I often get people saying, "Oh God, I'm new into my career. How do I network?" Because everyone says, particularly later in your career, you get your jobs through networking, and I've certainly found that to be true. But my interpretation of that is not I need to be at loads of drinks parties saying nice things to people. It's if you work really hard and deliver in a way where people want to be in the same team as you, people will notice. And when someone else is looking for someone to hire, they'll recommend you.
Yes.
And I was fortunate that kind of doing lots of hard work at Tandem led to Matt saying, "Oh, well, Octopus could be a good place for you." And I knew Simon, who's the Octopus founder, a little bit because he'd been involved in Tandem in the early days. So I was able to move over to Octopus actually because I wanted to work for Simon, who's a phenomenal entrepreneur. And I felt like it was the kind of place where almost regardless of what my job was, I would learn a lot. I would get to contribute a lot. He is an entrepreneur who is incredibly passionate about changing the world. So all of those things meant I was confident coming in that it didn't really matter what he asked me to do. I would feel inspired by it and I'd learn a lot from it. So I joined to help run the commercial bit of Octopus Investments, which is actually 23 years old now. So I was so Simon had been running it all that time, and then after I'd been in the group about 6 months, he asked me to take over running that business, which is a huge honor because I was the first person to run that bit who wasn't one of the founders. So it was a great opportunity, and I had a brilliant 4 years doing that.
Great. So tell us a bit more about the business for those listening that don't know about Octopus Investments. What where does it particularly focus, and what's the business model?
Yeah, so Octopus Investments raises money into very cleverly designed products for retail investors. So if you, as an example, if you are lucky enough to earn an amount that means you can't contribute any more to your pension, but yet you think, oh, I actually want to invest for my future, invest for retirement, you might look around for other ways in which to do that. Octopus has a product called a venture capital trust. And if you invest into a venture capital trust, you invest into a basket of early stage businesses. And because the government rightly wants to incentivize investment into early stage companies, it's what drives a disproportionate amount of economic growth, they give you a tax incentive to do that. So you get a tax incentive that's not dissimilar to the incentive you'd get for investing into a pension if you buy shares in a VCT. So Octopus create products like that and then invests the proceeds into, or invest the assets into venture capital, if that's the mandate, or into infrastructure, real estate, renewable energy, mainly real assets. So we, it's a dual thing, which is as a retail investor, you're looking for an opportunity for it to solve a financial challenge for you. For Octopus Investments, we're looking at ways in which we can move capital from people that have it to places that really need it and deliver good investment returns at the same time. So it's no coincidence that many of the end sectors we invest into drive UK growth, have a net zero incentive or education or healthcare or other societal needs, because that's what investors want to invest into fundamentally. And it's what we as a business feel we can bring expertise to, but also believe in, and believe that those are places that need capital. So that's in a nutshell what Octopus Investments does, which means when I'm out talking to people, particularly in the entrepreneur ecosystem, they've often heard of Octopus Ventures. Octopus Ventures invests that money that Octopus Investments raises. So that's how it all fits together.
Sure. So as you were talking there, I was thinking about some of the challenges you would have faced as CEO running that organization. So the immediate one that comes to mind is probably now there's been a huge societal shift and a focus a lot more on longer term investments that have a sustainable kind of core. But I suppose back then it was gaining momentum, but certainly I think since COVID and into sort of 21, 22, it's really raised its profile. So how back then were you balancing this sort of short-term potential investor demand for a return versus the long-term vision of investing in assets that had a for good cause in terms of society, and ensuring that I suppose you marketed yourselves in the right way that set the right expectations about what people were going to receive as part of that investment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It shifted a lot over the 5 years that I've been part of Octopus. So I'd say when I joined, institutional investors were already starting to invest with a thinking about the impact of the investments they were making, but very much with an ESG lens, which is sort of a do no harm lens, is kind of how I think about it. And I think as time's gone on, we've seen particularly retail investor appetite for positive impact investment has grown dramatically. What we've found, though, is that when push comes to shove, most people also want to invest for financial return. And it has to, because that's what makes the investment sustainable, and that's what makes the flow of capital robust. So the big shift, I think, over the last 5 years is that people have believed, and I think they're right to believe, and I think there's evidence that says this is absolutely correct, that impact and financial return go side by side rather than are in conflict with each other. I think 5 years ago, many people would have argued the opposite. I think now you would find far, far fewer people arguing the opposite. And, I always come back to a really logical argument, which is if you're a more sustainable business, your cost of capital should be lower in the long term, because the trends are that people want to invest in sustainable business. You should find it easier to raise money. You are a sustainable business that should be delivering into a theme that is a long-term theme. So that just logic dictates that should be a better investment. But I think we've now got empirical evidence that starts to prove that's the case. And that's amazing, because coming back to where we started, which is how do you find that intersection between for-profit and mission? Yeah. In investments, those two things are the same. And as soon as those two things are the same, you have something that is genuinely sustainable. And, one of the things I talk to the team about here, if we say, should we think about generating profit? I'm like, of course we should think about generating profit, because if we want to transform lives for the next 50 years, nothing exists in 50 years unless it's profitable to do so. It's just a fact of life. So do not think of those things as being in conflict with each other. Think of those things as really happy bedfellows, so long as you're operating your business in a way that is sustainable, responsible, isn't attempting to generate excessive profits, then you should absolutely think of those things as synonymous. And I think that's the argument that has largely been won, thankfully. The only other thing I'd say, actually, which is the other change I've seen, is I think we've shifted from people trying to prove that sustainability argument purely through data, which is complicated. And if you've ever tried to look at the ESG characteristics of your portfolio, your mind boggles on A, how many data points there are, and B, how much of that is evidence-based and how much of it is assumption.
Yes.
And so I think people often switch off to it. What we found is really powerful is stories. So just as when people are giving to charity, they want to understand the stories of the people they're impacting. When people are investing, I think they want to understand the stories of the change that those businesses are creating. And I think we've underestimated as a financial services industry how much people's heart actually plays into their investment decisions. And so bringing that to life has been a big theme of Octopus over the last 5 years as well.
Yeah, well, that's the really interesting point, because across the work that we do, we speak to a range of organisations who raise capital, and a shift that we've seen is individual institutional investors or whoever it may be, sovereign wealth funds, actually mandating to the organizations that are managing their capital to say, I'm actually not so interested in the financial return. I have a mandate of where the capital goes to ensure it is, a purpose-driven organization that can deliver exceptional impact, and almost being willing to accept the lower returns on the face that they put it into a place that's actually going to do good. And actually, what I've heard from individuals that are running that is the returns actually then do follow. So almost taking that statement to do something for good, and being willing to accept less for it. By and large, and of course not every time, but by and large has actually delivered better returns than perhaps expected. So that shift is so important, and I think is a really powerful thing for organisations to consider. So that was that was then. I suppose now we move on to Octopus Money, which was how we actually connected. I think we came together because I saw an article that you published around focusing very much around the S in ESG, which I think is forgotten and not spoken about enough. And one of the stats that really stood out to me was, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something around, I think it was Tembo Money, and it was said that a quarter of young adults will inherit more in their lifetime than they from their parents, and they would earn through their work, which just blew my mind really. And I don't think I've still really kind of comprehended exactly what that means. But the mission of Octopus Money and what you're doing, I think, is really powerful to share. So could you share that with everybody, and then talk a bit about what you're trying to do? Because I love the business idea, and I think it's at the heart of the sort of entrepreneurial value creation, but also so for good.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head with sort of one of the societal challenges that we're trying to play a small part in solving. But the vision of the business is to give everyone help with their money through a conversation with a person. And the best analogy I can think of is if you're ill. So imagine you're ill, and maybe your first instinct is you go on Google and you think, I'm going to self-diagnose, what could possibly be wrong with me? And then maybe do a bit of a questionnaire and you go, I don't know whether this is right. Then you go and see a doctor, because really, when it's something complicated that you would not claim to be trained in, you want to be able to say to someone, this is how I'm feeling, this is what's wrong with me, what do you think I should do? What do you think's wrong? Money is just the same. So with money, people might try and self-educate. There's loads of self-education resources out there. You can compare prices, you can go on Money Saving Expert, they're brilliant. But actually piecing all of that together when your background is not, how does that all fit together, is incredibly daunting. And the emotions most people talk about when you say, do you feel in control of your money, is they kind of say, no, I feel completely out of control. I feel like I'm always losing. I feel like I'm making the wrong decisions. I hate it. It's loads of admin. People are more likely to change their partner than to change their bank, all of those things. So the thing that you really boil it down to is not, I want to be able to invest cheaply, or I want to have more educational resources. It's, I just want someone to help me. And for all the right reasons, the regulatory framework around giving advice has meant that many players in the mass market have retreated from the sector. So once upon a time, you'd walk into your bank and someone in the bank would give you financial advice. And now that doesn't really happen. The building societies still do it a little, but by and large, in the mass market, so by that I mean most of us, don't know where to go for help with their money. So people carry it around like a ball and chain of, I feel like there's this thing that makes me feel stupid every day. It's every day I interact with this thing where I think I'm making the wrong decisions and I think other people are doing better than me. And yet no one knows where to go for help. So what we're trying to do is take the learnings from two industries that have strengths of their own. One is the robo-advice industry that's made some big strides forward, but I think really only works for people who are quite self-directed. Mm-hmm. And the financial advice industry, which works brilliantly for people who are wealthy. and bring those into a service where everyone gets a conversation, but then everyone also gets a set of tools that allow them to do something off the back of those conversations. And they can keep coming back to those conversations if they choose to. So we partner with employers because I think it is the next big workplace trend of, I think over the last 5 years, rightly, we focused an awful lot on firstly physical health and more recently mental health. Financial health is a trigger for mental health in particular, and mental health can also exacerbate financial health problems. So it's right that employers care about it. They lose productivity and fundamentally they lose talent because people go off in search of another salary if they don't understand and don't know how to manage their finances. So there's a commercial imperative as well as a well-being imperative. And when we roll out in the workplace, the most powerful thing that really brings home what a lack of provision there is 40% of people typically sign up for a session. So I can't think of another benefit I've ever launched as an employer where 40% of people sign up for a session. And it just shows that people have nowhere to go. When I come back to the stat that you quoted, which is indeed right, which says that if you look at wealth creation, a quarter of adults will create more wealth from inheritance than from everything they earn during their lifetime. That blows my mind. And it comes very back to where we started on opportunity. If that's the society we live in, where you create wealth from inheritance, not from hard work, that means that people who are fortunate enough to be born into family A have a completely different life from people who are sort of unfortunate to be born into family B. And that's not the society I want to live in. The society I want to live in evens that out. But if people don't understand money, it's very hard to even that out. So that's the societal change we want to drive.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing. I think it's as with most of these new ventures that Octopus go down, it sounds so simple and it sounds so needed, but nobody's been doing this to the level that you're doing it, and I think it's so inspiring to hear. So thank you for sharing. A couple of questions that I have. So the initial question that I was thinking before we spoke was, how do you as an organization actually monetize this? What's the value? How do you create the ability to continue to provide this service by the value that you create as an organization? So you mentioned you partner with employers, so I assume that there's some sort of partnership model or something like that, but would you mind just sharing a little bit more about what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So employers pay for it in one of two ways, or a mixture of both of them. Is either they pay for the sessions for employees, and the way that you would make a business case for that is you'd say the most frequently taken action when someone has a session is they put more in their pension. And you get a national insurance saving as an employer when people do that. Some people share that back with the employee, some people don't, but that's one way of offsetting the cost of it. Second is, 55% of people at the beginning of this year said, I'm going to job hunt this year because of cost of living and because I want to improve my salary. You have any leader of any business has got half of their employed population job hunting purely for salary. And if there's one thing that keeps me awake at night as leader of a business, it's losing brilliant people. So if you give people financial resilience, if you help them understand not just their salary, but their bonus, their pension, all of those other benefits you provide, the retention benefit that then feeds into recruitment costs and everything else, I'm going to put you out of business, is hugely powerful. And you get some insights into actually how do your employees feel about their benefits, which they'll tell you one thing, they'll tell you I want everything, but what do they actually care about? So that's an incredibly powerful business case as well. Some other employers, and this works too, we still get 20 to 30% take up, say, I'm going to provide this as a benefit, but you as an employee can pay for it if you choose to. That might be with a flex benefits, or it might be out of their own pocket. As I say, we still get quite a lot of people sign up for it, and they can pay for it normally through salary sacrifice. So that makes it cheaper for the employee. And because they're getting their money in shape, often their habits they change, etc., actually sort of it pays for itself. So we can operate under either model depending on the organization. Actually, when I launched it in Octopus Investments, initially, I decided to do a hybrid model where I funded it for people earning under a certain amount and let people earning over a certain amount fund it themselves if they chose to. So all sorts of models, and I think actually both carry pretty compelling business cases.
Sure, absolutely. I think most businesses have, and actually we as GS2, my organisation, have been reviewing our benefits. We're 18 months in now, and we're looking at what do our employees want. And as you say, it's very difficult to understand that from them because they perhaps sometimes don't know what they want. But an EAP, an employee assistance program, is something that most organisations probably do offer now, especially large ones. And when you look at the fine print on that, typically there's something around a helpline and some sort of financial advice is on there. But having been in a business where we had one, and I know a couple of people that made those calls, I think it's fair to say they were incredibly disappointed. It wasn't actually tailored advice with a real person having that real conversation. And I think that's where your business model really stands out, is that personable information that they can get from somebody where they can feel that they're really listened to, and it's a bespoke type of service.
I think that's it. And it's the heavy personalization. It's the recognition that money is not a maths discipline. Money is an emotion discipline, where sometimes people just want a safe space to say, I don't know what a pension is. And I don't know what my insurance is. And I feel too stupid to ask all these questions. The final aspect is it's kind of prevention versus cure. Is people, in my experience, employees will call the helpline when they're in crisis. And actually, there's a huge amount you can do to stop someone getting to crisis, which is about being understood, being heard, making some small changes that mean you never get to that crisis point. And I think that's where EAP is potentially part of the solution for crisis, but definitely doesn't get people to be more financially resilient. And critically, when we go back to the social mobility point, it doesn't create sufficient financial resilience that people think about their careers differently, that people are happy to go for the promotion because they feel like they have a small financial safety net that means if the worst were to happen, there's not going to be a huge impact on their family. I see so many people who choose not to progress because they feel like they've got to take the safe decision. They've got to be able to pay their rent next month. And that disproportionately impacts people who don't have a family that can afford to support them if it all goes wrong. And again, I think that exacerbates that inequality you see in society. So it all sort of wraps together. And I think we as employees have our part to play in that.
Sure.
Employers.
And it goes back, I think, to one of the things you were talking about in Sierra Leone is this education piece and it's on a different scale, of course, with the lack of ability to read and write, but on a different scale, the lack of ability to understand your finances means that you can't drive your own organization forward, or you can't drive your own career forward if the people within your business can't do that, or as an individual that you feel that you can't take those steps forward because you have that lack of understanding. So that, I suppose, the tailoring through with the education piece of providing that education to allow individuals and organizations to thrive surely is a great thing for the whole of our economy and moving society forward. So I love that thread that kind of has shown through your career, which I can certainly see coming back to play at Octopus Money. So how old is the organization? Because I know it's fairly new, isn't it?
Yeah, so I actually, we brought together two different businesses back in April this year. So we had a business called Octopus Money Coach that had been doing the coaching model for about 4 years, so pretty well established. We work with more than 200 workplaces, thousands of employees already. But we brought that together with an organisation called Octopus Wealth that was able to provide financial advice to people with more complicated needs. And we did that so that we can go into a workplace and say we can genuinely help anyone in the way they need to be helped. So if you've got a really complicated financial situation and kind of full-blown financial advice is the right answer, we can do that too. So that's when, in bringing those organisations together, that's when we created the Octopus Money brand. The elements of it have existed for a lot longer.
So what are the plans for the next 12 months, or perhaps even further, for where this can go? What's the
world?
Like, yes.
So yeah, kind of partner with more and more organisations because we know that there's a gigantic employee need. And, as with any new organisation, we're kind of fortunate enough that certainly more people have heard of Octopus now than they had when I joined the group 5 years ago. But lots of people say to me, why has an energy company started something about money, not realising that it actually happened the other way around.
Yes, yeah.
So the main people know we exist, encouraging employers to partner with us to give their employees access to a benefit like this, and then building out some of the things that we can help people with. So one of the first ways we've done that is we've got another business in the group called Guardian Angel that helps people at the point at which they suffer a bereavement or are actually preparing for how they can get their own house in order, write a will, write a power of attorney. So we know that the points in people's sort of financial lives that cause particular stress is when you pile on top a life event and an emotional stress point. So we started there with bereavement, but we think there are other life events that we'll be able to build out. So for an employer, when your employees are suffering particularly difficult situations, what they should expect from someone like Octopus is that we get that there's an emotional element to that and there's an administrative element to that. And we think that's the magic. If you can help people on both those, then you're actually getting them through a really tough situation. And what I observe most people do is kind of one or the other. I'll talk to you or I'll help you with this sort of nitty gritty. We aim to do both.
Sure, understand. And is it just UK focused right now, or is it international? Or is the plan
Yeah,
to
it
grow
is.
internationally?
It is at the moment. And, one day I'd love to be international. The tough thing about advice and guidance internationally is clearly all the tax rules and everything in different markets are different. So there will come a point when that's the right thing to do, but I'd much rather double down on making it brilliant in the UK for now.
Sure, understood. So as we come to the end of this fascinating conversation, and really I'd love to continue this, but I know we're both a little bit tight for time. I'm really keen to get to the core of what we talk about on this podcast, as in the name, Better Than We Found It. So as it aligns to the purpose of my organisation, GS2, we're on a critical journey to connect to the people who believe in leaving the world better than they found it. But I'm fascinated to hear about individuals who have been on this purpose-driven journey, to understand from you personally, by the end of your career, how would you like to reflect back or to see your legacy to show that you have left the world better than you found it?
Yeah, I hope that I will have created some ways in which the circumstances of your birth don't predict the opportunities you have in your life. And I think that's what ties together the school I still run in Sierra Leone, the organisation I run now, various other things I've done over my career. It's all to try and equalise opportunity for those people who are willing to sort of put in the work and change their outcome and make sure that there aren't societal or kind of institutional barriers that prevent them from doing that.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a very noble, but also progressive way of thinking, and I'm sure many others share your views with this. There will be certainly individuals and organisations that are keen to find out more about Octopus Money, I'm sure. So, if there are individuals keen to do that, would you be happy to connect with them and engage with others to talk about this, and also to signpost them in the way of how they could sign up if they were keen to find out more?
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. Find me on LinkedIn, and I would love to chat to anyone, whether it's about Octopus Money or kind of social mobility as a theme, or anything else that's piqued people's interest. So yeah, please get in touch.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful to share with you. Perhaps we could reflect in 12 months' time and chat again on how you have been taking over the world and moving things forward. But for now, thank you. Been brilliant to have you on, and love to hear what you're doing. Best of luck with it all, and look forward to catching up soon.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Better Than We Found It. I hope you have found value from this to support your own purpose-led journey. This episode was brought to you by GS2 Partnership, my organisation focused on providing talent solutions for sustainably focused organisations. We are driven by our purpose of connecting the people who believe in leaving the world better than we found it. If you are looking for a partner to support you with your hiring plans, or you are looking for your own career next steps, please reach out to us or personally drop me a message on LinkedIn. It's great to hear from listeners to the podcast, and I would welcome the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for our next episode.